International News Edition. His Majesty the King says Jordan supports regional and international efforts to combat radicalism and urges the United States to help relaunch Palestinian-Israeli peace talks. U.S. lawmakers pledged broad support for President Obama's plan to expand the military fight against Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria. And dozens of UN peacekeepers cross into the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights after being freed by a militant group in Syria. Good evening and very warm welcome to the news. His Majesty the King said Jordan supports regional and international efforts to combat radicalism. King Abdullah said during a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry yesterday that the kingdom's position is in consistency with its firm belief in the serious and direct threat the terrorist organizations pose to the region and the world. The talks came as a continuation of a summit the King held with U.S. President Barack Obama on the sidelines of a NATO summit held recently in Wales. The discussion also dealt with efforts to rebuild the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, and the situation in Syria and Iraq. His Majesty stressed the Palestine cause as the central issue in the region, urging Washington to work as soon as possible to create conditions conducive to relaunching Palestinian-Israeli peace talks. Such negotiations, he stressed, should address final status issues based on the two-state solution, the Arab Peace Initiative, and relevant international resolutions. King Abdullah said efforts must be directed towards rebuilding Gaza after the Israeli aggression, pledging that Jordan will continue to provide support and relief aid to the Palestinians. Kerry outlined the U.S. vision to rebuild Gaza and the U.S. administration's efforts to achieve peace in the region, in addition to the developments in Iraq and Syria. He also reviewed efforts led by the U.S. Both regionally and internationally to fight terror groups. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour discussed with UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Valerie Amos cooperation between Jordan and the United Nations, particularly regarding the provision of services to Syrian refugees. Mansour said the humanitarian repercussions of the Syrian crisis on Jordan had exacerbated the already tough economic conditions the kingdom was passing through due to its limited resources and insufficient foreign aid. The Prime Minister told Amos that the refugee crisis should be viewed from a wider perspective, beyond services and aid, pointing to social, economic and security costs. Throughout its history, Mansour said, Jordan had received waves of refugees from several countries that had suffered from wars and instability. He said the aid being offered to Jordan for hosting about 1.5 million Syrian refugees, half of them living in the kingdom before the Syrian conflict began, would only cover a fraction of the cost of hosting them. The Parliament, both Lower House and Senate, has passed the amended civil retirement draft law during a joint session chaired by Senate President Abdul Rauf al-Rawad. During the session, attended by Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour and cabinet ministers, the MPs voted for an article stating that a minister or parliament member is entitled to retirement after 7 years in service. U.S. lawmakers pledged broad support for President Barack Obama's plan to expand the military fight against Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria. But fears of an open-ended conflict could complicate a vote to back the effort. The White House has asked lawmakers to vote to authorize $500 million in aid for moderate Syrian rebels who are fighting Islamic State on the ground. Here's more in this report.
Laying out his strategy to deal with Islamic State ISIS militants, U.S. President Barack Obama has authorized U.S. airstrikes for the first time in Syria and more attacks in Iraq.
Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy.
But Obama said he will not waver under threats.
We will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists. Working with the Iraqi government, we will expand our efforts beyond protecting our own people and humanitarian missions so that we're hitting ISIL targets as Iraqi forces go on offense.
Iraq welcomed Obama's decision. Deputy Prime Minister Hoshyar Zubari called on Arab countries and others who joined Obama's alliance to help stop the movement of ISIS fighters and cut its funding.
The announcement of the new strategy announced by President Obama last night, I think it's a wise and a bold strategy. It will help to push back to defeat ISIS.
Germany and Britain said they would not be taking part in airstrikes in Syria against the Islamic State militant group. German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier said Germany has not been asked to take part in the airstrikes and would not be participating. His British counterpart Philip Hammond said Britain supported entirely the US approach against ISIS, which he described as barbaric.
We will now consider in the UK very carefully how best we can contribute to that international coalition. We have ruled nothing out. We will look carefully at our options and decide how we will make a contribution, but we are clear that we will make a contribution.
Syria gave a chilly response to US plans to strike against Islamic State militants within its borders. Minister of National Reconciliation Affairs Ali Haddad warned against using the threat of Islamic State as an excuse for foreign intervention in Syria. He said any foreign intervention in Syria would be an act of aggression unless it is approved by Damascus. Russia backed the Syrian position, warning that airstrikes against the militants in Syria without a UN Security Council mandate would be an act of aggression. Khaled Ababne for the News at 10.
Foreign ministers from Arab countries and the United States meeting in Saudi Arabia have unveiled plans to combat Islamic State militants. These include stopping the flow of funds to ISIS fighters and helping communities threatened by the group. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry joined ministers from the Gulf Arab countries, Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan and Iraq at the meeting in Jeddah to discuss efforts to combat terrorism. Foreign Minister Nasser Judeh told the meeting Jordan has been firm on the need to stand against and root out terrorism, as the kingdom had been a victim of terrorism. He said the militant group had exploited the security and political vacuum and the policies of exclusion and sectarian polarization in Iraq and Syria to control large swathes of territory in the two countries. Kerry pressed Arab countries to back President Barack Obama's new military drive against the Islamic State militants. The American Secretary of State is due to visit Turkey tomorrow as part of a tour to rally efforts to tackle the Islamic State militant group. Dozens of Fijian UN peacekeepers have been released by Al-Qaeda-linked group Nusra Front in Syria and arrived in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. The peacekeepers were taken hostage 2 weeks ago when several Islamist militant groups, including Nusra, attacked in the volatile frontier between Syria and the occupied Golan Heights. After the peacekeepers crossed over, they were driven away in a convoy of UN minibuses. Nusra initially said it held the peacekeepers because they were aiding soldiers loyal to President Bashar al-Assad. Later, sources close to the group said it demanded the removal of the group from the West's terrorist list. It was not immediately clear if a deal was struck for their release. The head of Fiji's army said the Islamist militant group had dropped all of its demands to free the 45 hostages, but at least slightly backpedaled later in the day as the situation appeared to deteriorate. In Damascus, United Nations International Mediator to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, met Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and other officials. Mistura described the meeting as long and useful, but declined to give details. He said the United Nations would work with Syria to help tackle the violence, provide humanitarian aid and work on a solution to the crisis. Earlier, Mistura told reporters that the fight against terrorism and political reform should progress hand in hand in Syria. The rights watchdog Human Rights Watch said Israel had committed war crimes by attacking 3 schools run by the United Nations in the Gaza Strip. Schools were among other civilian targets bombed during Israel's 50-day war in July and August, in which Palestinian civilians who had sheltered there were killed. The New York-based group issued a report that it described as the first in-depth documentation of the incidents. During the Gaza fighting, Israel rejected preliminary Human Rights Watch findings. It committed war crimes and said the group should focus on Hamas, putting Palestinian civilians in harm's way. The Israeli military said it had launched 5 criminal investigations into its Gaza war operations. Hamas called the investigations worthless. Human Rights Watch also said it is skeptical about their credibility.
Now, that's obviously better than doing nothing, but we are concerned and we think the pressure needs to stay on because the Israeli military's record for accountability is extraordinarily poor. There has never really been real accountability for any of the crimes committed during Operation Cast Lead, 2008-2009, not even any criminal investigations opened into Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. It's not cause for optimism.
Over to Yemen, where the country's government and Houthi rebels pursued talks to end a crisis that has been or seen weeks of sometimes bloody protest in the capital, Sana'a. The Houthis have been fighting in a decade-old conflict with the central government for control in the north. Houthi protesters have been blocking the main road to Sana'a's airport and holding sit-ins for weeks at ministries in an attempt to oust the government and restore fuel subsidies. A member of the government's negotiating team said both sides had signed an agreement that includes a further reduction of fuel prices and the formation of a new government to end the crisis. The Defense Ministry and the Houthis said a political breakthrough is imminent. 13 years ago, or 13 years on, politicians, dignitaries and victims' relatives gathered in New York City, at the Pentagon and in rural Pennsylvania to remember 9/11, when nearly 3,000 people were killed in Al-Qaeda's attack on the United States. In what has become an annual ritual, relatives began slowly reciting the names of the victims at a ceremony in Manhattan. A silver bell was rung to herald moments of silence, marking the times when each of the 4 planes hijacked by militants crashed and the World Trade Center's Twin Towers fell. President Barack Obama spoke at the Pentagon during a private ceremony for relatives of the 184 people killed in the attack on the headquarters of the U.S. Defense Department in Virginia. He laid a wreath of white lilies and mums and kept his hand on his heart as taps played.
My mother, Sandy Wall Bradshaw.
The Environment Ministry and the German Agency for International Cooperation, GIZ, have signed 2 agreements under which the agency will fund a project that will provide solar-powered air conditioning to 2 government buildings. The project involves the installation of solar cells and central air conditioning to the Royal Cultural Center in Amman and the Irbid Chamber of Commerce. Environment Minister Tahir Shekhshir said during the signing ceremony that 2 similar agreements were sealed with the Social Security Corporation and the Jordanian German University, and the air conditioning system will be up and running next month. Jordan will be the first country in the region to use the solar-powered air conditioning technology, and the projects will help reduce the energy bill. German Ambassador Ralph Taraf told Jordan's television's reporter Mansour Al-Abadi that it will help the Jordanian economy.
Today, 2 agreements have been signed between the GIZ, which are Technical Development Cooperation Agency, and the Royal Cultural Center and the Chamber of Commerce of Irbid. 2 agreements which will bring about green technology, ecologically sustainable technology in cooling systems, solar panels which will produce the energy to provide solar cooling. This is a very important project, a very central project for Jordan, which is, of course, as we all know, does not have many natural resources in the field of energy. And we stand ready to support Jordan with all the projects necessary and needed to promote a green and ecologically sustainable economy.
Ever had a taste of prison life without a jail sentence? A restaurant adorned with chains and dimly lit corridors offers diners in China's eastern port city of Tianjin that sort of taste. The restaurant, called 789, offers a dinner behind the bars, served by waiters clad in prison guard attires. Its first floor features mostly traditional iron bar jail cells, while the second floor has the customers literally locked away in solitary confinement cells. Rather than directly speaking to a waiter, customers must select their orders on an iPad menu in order to isolate themselves from the outside world. The restaurant offers a fusion of traditional Chinese dishes and their own spin on popular Western dishes such as spaghetti. British driver Chris Meek posted the fastest time in the shakedown for the Rally Australia. The Citroën DS3 driver was quickest by 4 milliseconds from his teammate Norwegian Mads Osberg. Hyundai's Belgian Thierry Neuville was third. The test took place on a 4.98-kilometer section of the Hyde Greek special stage on the outskirts of host town Corps Harbour. French President François Hollande welcomed leading figures from the world of football alongside representatives from host cities and government ministers at the Élysée Palace to discuss the upcoming Euro 2016 football tournament. In a speech, Hollande said the competition would have numerous economic and social benefits for France. President of the UEFA, Michel Platini, said that hundreds of thousands of spectators were expected and that France should focus on winning since they already have experience in organizing competitions of this nature. Qualifying rounds kicked off on Sunday, where the 54 UEFA teams will be whittled down to just 24 before the tournament in France, which begins in June 2016.
Au niveau de l'organisation, c'est facile. On a l'habitude, Jacques Lambert a l'habitude, l'UEFA a l'habitude d'organiser les compétitions.
And finally, a look at the weather forecast. Pleasant tonight in most regions with northwesterly fresh to brisk winds. Mild weather is forecast for much of the country, except in the Jordan Valley, where temperatures will soar to the high 30s. The hilly areas should expect low clouds in the morning hours, while winds will be northwesterly fresh, picking up at times. And further south, it will be hot in the port of Aqaba with northerly fresh winds and calm seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. Now, our top stories. Once again, His Majesty the King says Jordan supports regional and international efforts to combat radicalism and urges the United States to help relaunch Palestinian-Israeli peace talks. US lawmakers pledge broad support for President Barack Obama's plan to expand the military fight against Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria. And dozens of UN peacekeepers cross into the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights after being freed by a militant group in Syria. And that's the end of tonight's news. My name is Raad Btoush. Thank you so much for your company.